Hello and welcome to this New Year episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Cannon.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this is our end of year, New Year episode. We talked about what kind of things we might talk about in the episode and what we might do. And obviously, we've recently done the Christmas episode where we steadfastly avoided talking about Father Christmas and what kind of a leader he was. But we were thinking about this. The first episode of Battling with Business went out on the 26th of January, 2023. So the 26th of January this year. Yeah. We're kind of coming up to the first year, certainly in terms of how we do the recordings as well. Yeah. And so we thought what might be interesting is just a little bit of a reflection. We got a glass of wine in hand, and so we can sit back and talk about stuff that puts a smile on our face. And maybe there's some stuff that's interesting in here. Either A, whether you've been a follower of the podcast and listened to some or indeed all of the episodes, or whether you're interested in hearing sort of our experiences recording what is now well over 50 episodes. Yeah. Well, look, Gareth, why don't we start?
Well, firstly, Happy New Year.
Oh, Happy New Year to you. Did you have a nice Christmas, Gareth?
Given that it's the 30th of November, it's difficult for me to answer that.
You've ruined it. You've ruined it. Well, we're looking forward to having a wonderful Christmas. Yeah. First year.
Yeah.
First of all, did you think we'd even get here? You must have done, because when you set your mind to something, you very much do it.
I did. We talked about it for several weeks before we actually started to make sure that each of us were as committed as the other. So I did think we'd get here. I think I underestimated how much work it is to do a podcast.
Well, I mean, I'm going to congratulate you more than me. So more often than not, I do the easy bit, which is turning up and talking. Although, to be fair, with our families and our work lives, even that's a bit tricky. But you actually have done, frankly, the hard miles by doing all the editing. And so I feel guilty, but grateful.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it is hard work. But I think the thing we tried to do when we set out was make sure that we enjoyed it. And we said, this isn't about trying to get to the top of the podcast charts or making vast amounts of money or seeking fame and fortune. It was about exploring ideas and topics in a slightly more formalized way, which would force us to do more research, more reading, meet new people, give us an excuse to meet new people. And I think we've done that, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's been really interesting, which we will get into talking about.
Yeah, we absolutely will. But I concur with you, which is, I think it's a novelty when you start. And we looked at the data, and I think 90% of all podcasts in the world finished after episode 3 or 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
But this really did, for me, give us an excuse to have these conversations, which actually you would occasionally do on an ad hoc basis, but this has almost forced us to have a bit more rigor.
Yeah, for me, it's been really interesting because the thing about a podcast is you're trying to attract listeners, you're trying to grow your audience, you're trying to develop the content, and there's a whole world of sort of media production, engagement, social media, and it's a world that I've not really been part of or had any experience of. But we do talk about fake news, we talk about sensationalism, we talk about information flows, and there is a draw to be sensationalist, to create those clickbait discussions, content, subjects that are going to almost cheating and getting a whole load of listeners because you're being provocative. And I think we set out from the very beginning making sure we don't do that. And it's interesting how much you start focusing on the numbers, focusing on how many followers, how many downloads we got. And I hope going forward we continue to stick to the principle of we talk about things that interest us, we research as thoroughly as time allows, but we don't cut corners in the analysis that you and I talk about. We're not trying to create controversy.
I like the fact every episode isn't us going, what's the title that's going to get the most people to download it? We have little time to think about these and record these, and so therefore the fact that it really is us figuring out on the go in many cases and working out how we believe. I have absolutely loved it, and it is cheaper than going to the pub, which is how obviously this all started. So at one sense it's cheaper, so the families don't see us spending as much money going down the pub, but on the other side, I think they're sick of the sight of us turning up and saying,
I think you should also apologise to Steve, who has missed out on numerous pub trips because we've been recording rather than pubbing.
That is very true. Maybe we'll have to combine and do both of those things.
We should record an episode from the pub.
That's a great. We're going to come back, by the way, towards the end of this, and we're going to talk about some guests and also some what we want to talk about. But I love that idea. In fact, I think for 2024, more on-site recordings. I know we've got one or two ideas around that, but I like the idea of going where some of our guests are as well.
Yeah.
But for me, the thing that has kept it fresh and interesting is the range of topics and the range of guests. I love the fact, and it tickles me, we've started some of these episodes with an element of, is this going to make sense in terms of what we're trying to talk about? So, I think one of my favorite ones, I'm getting ahead in terms of some of the guests, which was Ian Pegg, talking about Padres in the Second World War. And what we do is typically both of us sort of have guests we have in mind or people we've met. Interesting. And I have to believe Gareth was a little bit, well, okay, Chris, if you think this is a good idea. But what really tickled me was as we went through that conversation and every other conversation we've done, there's these little light bulb moments when we realize actually the tentacles of management and leadership go in really unexpected places. So I've loved the range of topics, but I've also loved the unexpected nature where we can find these echoes kind of wherever we look as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I come back to what I said before. It also forces us to take the subjects quite seriously in a way that if we were just you and I in the pub talking about it, you wouldn't do the pre-reading to make sure you're not caught out. If you're going to have guests on, you can't just wing it.
No, that's true.
That applies a sort of level of discipline to the subjects that we're covering in a way that in my day job I didn't have. So I do a lot of reading around these kind of subjects for my day job, but there's no pressure to hit a deadline. Like you must, be confident about talking about this subject by this time. So this has really forced me to read about things that I wouldn't necessarily normally read about and explore new ideas. That's really healthy. You were saying that one of our previous guests, Paul Armstrong, was messaging you and mentioned that he saw the Dolly Parton Influencers episode and said, well, I wasn't expecting that, and then loved the episode. So hi to Paul out there if you're listening. Yeah, but very kindly shared it in a mutual WhatsApp group that we're in, the Technology Behaviour Data group, just to plug Paul's technology conference. And if you haven't got your tickets, they are still available for the TBD conference on the 27th of February this year. And of course, I will be talking again. And of course, you should listen to the interview we did with Paul, where we talked about technology and looking ahead. But the other thing that's I've loved is it's really kept the flame of curiosity burning. Yes. Because one of the things that has become clearer to me as we've talked about a set of incredibly diverse topics is that actually the same themes pop up week after week after week after week. So I would argue 50 weeks ago, if you'd have said, what makes a good leader, let's say, which is the classic cliche, I would have probably given you sort of a stock answer. But 50 weeks into this, we've talked about this in so many different ways with so many different people. I think my answers are much more based on, you can see the rhythms, you can see the patterns across the world, and you can start to sort of picture that a lot more. So I've really enjoyed that as well. There are people that I have worked with or paths have crossed at events, and you trade business cards or take details or connect on LinkedIn, and then you have no reason to continue that conversation, but you'd really like to. They're the kind of people that you probably like to have a couple of pints with and talk about these issues or discussions, but you don't have a reason, and it would just be weird to sort of reach out and say, I don't really know you. Do you want to go to the pub?
To be fair, I suspect many of our guests think it's a bit weird we reach out anyway. But I do agree with you. And if you said to me, pick the single most exciting excuse for doing this podcast, actually, for me, it is the guests.
Yeah.
Because to your point, many of the guests that we've spoken to, and by the way, we should acknowledge how incredibly lucky we are to have so many people that have been willing to turn up. People don't know the podcast. It's a pretty niche podcast. And actually, well, first thing is no one has said no. Literally, no one has said no. There's lots of people who say, maybe I'm a bit nervous about going on a podcast, or people where it's a little bit more difficult to sort of get the time to sort of connect with them. But I mean, I was just thinking back to Larissa Brown, who's the defense correspondent for the Times, and her book about the Gardener of Lashkar. We heard her interviewing General Petraeus and Andrew Roberts, who is another defense expert. We literally said, Larissa is a fascinating person. We should go up and talk to her. And she was very, very kind and agreed to appear on the podcast. So just that opportunity, that excuse to go find some of these people and go talk to them, that is really good. The excuse that the podcast gives to get people who have expertise that otherwise you wouldn't normally have access to, that actually is the highlight for me. And in a bit, we should talk about sort of some of our favorite guests and who we've got on as well. For me as well, I've really enjoyed and actually been surprised by the feedback. One of the things that's really weird about doing a podcast is, of course, you can't see who's listening. We've admitted that there's and I think we're getting better. There's this weird thing where you've got to go look at the download numbers. But on the other hand, then you have no idea who is actually listening.
Yeah.
And I think both of us have had this sort of case where you bump into people and they say, love the podcast. And actually, that's really, really lovely when you get to see people who have sort of listened to it.
Yeah.
Go on. I can see what you've got in front of you.
Yeah. What we obviously can't do is find out who's listening, but we can look at when people listen, what podcast platform they use. But I think most interestingly, where they are in the world. And as you'd expect, the vast majority of our listeners are from here in the UK.
Yep.
Second to that is the US. And that's, I think, a mix of the subjects that we cover are perhaps interesting to people in the US as much as the UK. You worked there and lived there for a long time. I've got connections with the US Marines and other bits of the US defense establishment.
Go on, read out some of the countries.
Canada is obviously quite helpful in there. I work in Canada a lot. I've got lots of contacts out there. France, and I think a big part of that's probably John. But yeah, there's some really random ones as well. So all the normal ones you'd expect: the UK, US, France, Canada, Germany, Ireland, Greece, Spain, Australia. And I'm now going to scroll to the bottom of the list and start reading upwards. So Moldova, Cyprus, Switzerland, Austria, the United Arab Emirates, Argentina, Italy, Japan, Nepal, Philippines, Qatar, Thailand, Ukraine, Turkey, Singapore, Norway, Croatia, Jersey, New Zealand, Sweden, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Czech Republic, South Africa, Estonia, Portugal, Nigeria, India, the Netherlands, Denmark.
It's quite remarkable. Look, I mean, for those people listening, and I'm sure we've lost a bunch of people who said, what topic are they going to talk about today? And it's just a bunch of people drinking and reminiscing and listing countries. But actually, genuinely, if you're one of those listeners who's outside of the sort of the UK, US, Canada, please email us and tell us who you are and what you do and how you came across us and what you like. We're really, I think, to start with, it was a very sort of homegrown, people we knew would sort of find us. But what's really fascinating as we look at the numbers, it does grow. And so we're finding new people around the world. So frankly, we would absolutely love to hear from you as well. I want to, I have a Catholic background, and so I want to share my guilt. you talked about the fact that you do the editing, and I think we've definitely got ambition to do more. I actually lie awake at night occasionally because I remember you saying, in the next week, we're going to have all the transcripts up. And I know we haven't done that. In fact, here's the funny thing. We have 15 transcripts because I've gone away and done all the work to turn those into transcripts. We haven't put them together. So this is my guilt in front of our audience to say, yeah, that is something we absolutely have to do. And over Christmas, when we have a bit of time, we'll definitely put those up there.
Well, I think in the new year, I think one of the aims is to start a Patreon page so we can upload content and engage more with the audience. And I think in the first year, it's achieved everything I wanted to achieve, which is we've learned how to do it, maintained consistency, reached out to people and sort of started to build a network. For the next year, I'd like to turn it into more of a podcast with content that goes with it, a Patreon page, probably get a little bit better at the social sort of engagement and all that sort of stuff. But keep going really, and hopefully have a range of equally interesting guests, more interesting topics. I think there's so much we haven't explored that we still yet.
We again sort of, given this episode, we have a list of topics that we want to cover, and I think we've got a good 20 or 30 topics on there. So and frankly, every week we sort of bump into each other walking the dog, or whenever we see each other, this thing happened. Well, look, let's do a bit of that. As I said, one of the particular highlights for me has been this idea of bringing guests in. Who have been some of your favorite guests? And by the way, I should be very careful. Inevitably, we're not going to mention everyone. Yeah. And so I do want to say thank you to every guest.
Absolutely, yeah. And the podcast only works because we have guests, we have subjects that are interesting. Yeah, so I agree. I really enjoyed the 2 episodes we did with Rich Seal from Creatively Challenged, which we recorded off. I think the only episode, apart from when we've been away with work and we've dialed in, the only episode that we recorded off-site and we did at the Future Strategy Club. And I really enjoyed those because they similar related subjects, but went in 2 very different directions. So one we talked about with Rich, who is a designer, the role of leadership in design and how design affects organizations and creativity affects organizations. And I thought that was a fascinating conversation.
Well, he has a fascinating background as well in terms of the design work that he's done on things like, I think it was Hyperloop. That was one of his... the
Virgin Galactic spacecraft, electric vehicles, packaging, which is one of those things that is really mundane until you actually look at how it's created in the design process.
And the whole aspect of teams as well.
Yeah.
And I loved the discussion we had about whether AI was coming for us.
Yeah.
And we talked about the role of AI in creativity. And it was only this week I was having a discussion with some of my colleagues about AI, and that conversation came to mind when I said, it's not whether the AI are going to beat the designer, it's the designer with an AI assistant is going to beat the designer.
That human machine team.
I just thought that was so interesting.
And it was a refreshing conversation at a time where AI was sort of being talked about a lot as either this dystopian future.
We will all die.
We're all going to die. Or it's this utopian, no one has to work anymore. We're going to solve the energy problem, the energy crisis. We're going to solve global warming because AI is going to help us and it's all going to be wonderful. And actually what was refreshing with Rich was that conversation was very nuanced about how it affects now, how he thinks and how we thought it was going to affect the future, and the fact that it's not a utopia or a dystopia.
But it was refreshingly optimistic as well.
It's a thing we have to deal with, and there is opportunities, there is challenge and there is risk. But you've got to face it with optimism. You've got to face it with passion, because if we're going to get on with AI and make it work for us, we've got to design the future that we want to live in. And that for me was the key takeaway, and such an interesting conversation. So what about you? Who's your...
Well, so many. There's people who've noticed there's probably a little bit of a theme here where my historical interest typically lies in the Second World War. That's where I spend a lot of time. We've been really, really, really lucky to have a number of guests who come from that world. And one we had recently was Dr. Waitman Beorn, who not only is an ex-US Marine cavalryman.
He wasn't Marine, Army, US Army cavalryman.
Army, sorry, if Waitman's listening, he'll now
Mark
be.
McGraths was US Marine.
He'll, and I have to be very careful because I'm surrounded by Marines
who don't like being called Army and Army people.
Well, I was about to
like
say, my CEO, my US CEO is a US Marine, so I have to be very careful. I'm seeing him next week, so I have to be very particularly careful. Anyway, no, but what hoorah, and apparently something about eating crayons. Does that extend to the UK Marines eating crayons?
I've heard many a Matt Lowe talk about Marine eating crayons.
Where did this? Sorry, for the audience who doesn't know, the British military, and of course militaries around the world, have a very robust relationship with the other branches of the military. And so, for example, many of our RAF friends, people tease them about what life on the front line in their hotel room is like. You know, various things about the Royal Navy, which I won't repeat because they're, first of all, slander. and secondly, honestly, just genuinely not true from my experience. But there is, particularly I've heard this more for the US Marines, which is the crayon eating, that they eat crayons. Why do they eat crayons?
So I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that is a reference to sort of kindergarten or nursery school children who eat the crayons, you know, the thick kids in the corner, which is, I find really interesting, because in my experience, and I'm completely biased, of course.
Why would that be?
Because if you cut me, I bleed the Royal Marines.
Green.
But in my experience, you know, your average Royal Marine, I'm not talking about commissioned officers or senior NCOs, your average Marine is far brighter. Maybe not academically, they don't necessarily have the educational background, but in terms of ingenuity, judgment, capacity to take in information, than your average sailor, airman, soldier. Now, there are exceptions, of course. There are bell curves in all organisations, but
can I just say,
ironic.
You slipped that in there, brighter than the Royal Navy, and you just didn't even pause there when you say that.
It's ironic that we're known as, you know, the thick kids who you know, failed at school, so they joined the Marines. And actually, I think we were talking about this the other day. The selection criteria at the Admiralty Interview Board for commissioned officers in the naval service, the highest scores go to Royal Marines and aviators, aircrew.
You're just saying that to make me feel better, because in fact I passed the AIB.
You did,
so you're trying to do that. Okay. All right. Well, no, but going back to the guest, having Waitman on was just tremendous. So Waitman is a professor of Holocaust studies, and I was very passionate for him to tell the story, because it's not, I think, the narrow story that I suspect many of our listeners have heard, but it was a much broader story. That in itself was worth it alone. If he'd have just come on and given us a historical lecture, that would be valuable. But I remember before we started recording, I made the point that I wanted to be so careful that we didn't trivialize it and then say, and these are the lessons we can draw. And I remember the moment in the conversation with Waitman where he said, look, Chris, I think you need to stop saying that, because actually there are clear lessons. And I thought that was such a really interesting conversation that led us right back to the heart of what we talk about in terms of, you know, the standards you walk by, the standards you accept. I've used that phrase lots and lots recently where I work.
Good.
But so I love that.
Yeah, so I had Waitman down as one of my favourite episodes as well. And I think it's interesting. We obviously record several weeks in advance. We recorded that episode before the horrific Hamas attack in Gaza, but we released it after and during, you know, it's ongoing, the current crisis in the Middle East. And a couple of people I spoke to, and I said, we've just recorded this really interesting episode. And a couple of people said, oh, are you going to release it now? There's a lot of conversation about anti-Semitism. There's a lot of, you know, polarized views. It's a very contentious thing. We had that discussion and said, no, we've got to talk about it. And one of the things I want to continue doing with this podcast is to not be afraid to tackle complex, contentious, polarized, heated and loaded issues, as long as we are honest with ourselves and honest with our audiences. And as long as we are, upfront about that, we are not experts in most of the things we talk about, but we shouldn't shy away from having difficult discussions. So I was really pleased that we pushed that one out, and actually all the feedback we've had has been really, really good. So if you haven't listened to that episode, definitely want to go and see
episode 43. I did my
good knowledge.
Well, no, not good knowledge. I don't read much, but I write notes apparently for the episodes. That was a good one. So, what was one for you then?
Yeah, another one for me. Early on, one of the first guests we had was Colonel Joe Brown, who is a very close personal friend of mine anyway, and we worked together a long time ago. And a lot of the things we talked about in the episodes are things that Joe and I have had long conversations about in the past, but really important conversations. And we met each other when we were sort of middling officers, like middle management, if you like, as both majors in me and the Marines, Joe in the Army, but working together in the same unit. Joe was the Deputy Chief of Staff and I was the Operations Officer. So I was responsible for sort of day-to-day meeting of the current demand. And the Deputy Chief of Staff's job is to manage personnel management, careers, retention, discipline. And so that we overlapped a lot when we were talking about the people in the organisation. And that's why things like mentoring, coaching were such important subjects. And Joe's gone on to have a very successful career and is continuing to do so, and he's doing very, very well. And part of that is his passion for investing in the people, not just the people under his charge in whatever command position he's in, but people generally across the military, people that he interacts with day to day. And it's that genuine passion for getting the best out of people and teams that I think we really explored in those episodes, and that Joe sort of embodies, and is a great example of where the military creates really good leaders who are knowledgeable about their subjects, capable of managing stressful conditions, judgment, difficult conditions when they haven't slept, and all of the stuff we've kind of talked about, but also have learnt, developed, and become passionate about getting the best out of people. And one of the things we haven't talked about, and it's not even on our list, and it's only just occurred to me that we should probably talk about, is what value veterans have to civilian organisations. That's a good one. We should definitely do.
Well, we'll come back to that in terms of episodes we want to do. See, this is the perfect example about why we do this, which is even when we talk about things which we think are just, reminiscing the things we've enjoyed doing, new ideas sort of appear. And one of those is, it turns out there are more people that want to talk about what makes good managers, good leaders, good business. We've been lucky, we found all of these people, but I think the point is they already existed. We just connected them. So
yeah.
We have talked a lot about curiosity, and I think for all of our listeners, go talk to people you work with, go talk to people you know. And if you haven't done that, I think you'll be surprised actually how much people want to engage in that conversation. So we're lucky we've got this network of people and we can find these people. Please don't underestimate the person sitting next to you, the person you work with, your manager, the people that report to you. I think they're super valuable. And it's a really interesting conversation that everyone has a perspective. That's the other thing I think we've learned this year.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to put these two together again, and I think they represent, again, this idea of the value of history can tell us some interesting things, but also what's been great about this podcast is a chance to connect with old friends and a chance to make new friends. And so Ian Pegg, episode 32, write that down, who talked about the role of chaplains. And I've mentioned that one already today, but I love that because
I'm going to pour some wine.
Please.
Shall I do it loud?
You have to do it loudly. We had someone say how much they enjoyed that, so you should do that. But I love that because just this idea of chaplains in World War II, as I said earlier, you would think, what could we learn about this? And yet it was super enlightening. And then we went to someone else who's so Ian is a new friend, of the podcast and person I've got to know.
That was a great episode.
That was a great episode. But then another one, so Mary Brazier, who I've known a little bit longer, and we met on a World War II battlefield tour, who talked about RAF aircrew and stress and how you dealt with that. And in what we've often found with our guests, particularly the ones who come from a historical background, is that they often, their interests historically reflect their interest in day-to-day. So Ian is a senior manager in a government organization, and Mary is a senior manager in the NHS. So I love those. So Ian's was episode 32, the role of chaplains, and Mary was episode 40. Sorry, Ian was episode 32, Mary episode 45. And fantastic, these unexpected insights, frankly, and the excuse to learn interesting new stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think finally for me, talking about guests we've had on, it's a very recent one, was Mark McGrath. We're going to talk, I think, about some of our favorite episodes, and I'm pretty sure John Boyd will come up as one of those. John Boyd being the late Lieutenant Colonel from the US Air Force who came up with the concept of the OODA loop and a whole load of thinking around adaptive systems. We did John Boyd in the Influencers episode, and I think we both agreed that we had potentially sort of done the subject of John Boyd justice, but hadn't gone into anywhere near enough detail around the concept of the OODA loop itself. And I happen to have already been talking to Mark McGrath, who's a former, in fact, I'm not allowed to say that, a US Marine.
Yeah, because you're never a former US
Marine.
Marine.
Serving artillery officer, but a US Marine, so once a Marine, always a Marine, Semper Fi, who then through a 20-year career in asset management, a master's degree in economics, had and a prolific reader, such a bright guy with so many references and insights to talk about the realities of what we mean by the concept of the OODA loop. And I talk about it as a concept rather than a model or a process or a thing, because the key point that came out of it in both the John Boyd episode and our interview with Mark was how much this is an evolving process.
I don't think we successfully completed scratching the OODA loop itch.
No,
but that's the topic of that's the point of it, which is there's so many dimensions to it, and rather than it's definitely not a circular diagram. That was one thing Mark was very clear on. Don't draw it as a circle.
And one of the things I absolutely love about Mark is his passion for the subject and his recognition that this is not about telling a story about somebody else's work. This is a continuation of an evolving, organic thing, organic developing understanding. It's a field of research, not a concept, a doctrine, or a model. And so for me, a brilliant, only just been released, but a brilliant episode and one that I thoroughly enjoyed. And I can't wait to have Mark back on the podcast in the future. And we could obviously advertise Mark McGrath and Ponch Rivera's podcast, No Way Out. If you want to know more about John Boyd, dynamic systems and OODA loops, absolutely the podcast to listen to, No Way Out. It's brilliant.
Yeah, fantastic. And another example of one of those people who my head hurts at the end of it because of those.
But in a good way.
In a good way, because so the source. Last couple of people. A very old friend of mine. Sorry, that sounds like he's old. What I mean is I've been friends with him for many years, Douglas Waterfall. And what was really, for me, really fascinating was he is a software engineer by trade. And I loved his take on leadership and management. So his episode was all about why teams don't work and hubris and humility. So that was episodes 29 and 30. But it was such a different take on the leadership. He doesn't come from that, I write books or I think about this or grant. This is just a person on the ground who over many years has tried to figure this stuff out in his own world as a software engineer.
And what I love about Douglas is he is an acronym, which is somebody whose name matches their job. So his name is Douglas Waterfall. We talked a lot about the movement from waterfall to agile methodology.
Well, I was going to say, surely that means he's not, because he is agile.
Anti-acronym.
Anti-acronym.
Yeah, but it's just brilliant, isn't it? It's like, being called Mr. Baker and being a professional chef, or,
See, these are the things that amuse the podcast. Two last ones. Theo Bigby. So Theo stands out for me. And actually, it's a very, very popular episode. Theo stands out for me because Theo emailed you and picked us up on some language and said it wasn't clear what you were saying. We used the term woke I think
Theo was very politely, and I know Theo through the Future Strategy Club, reached out and very politely said, I think I understand what you're trying to say, but you keep talking about the value of diversity, not for the purposes of inclusion, not for the purposes of fairness, but we mean diversity in terms of diversity of thought. And he said, they're not mutually exclusive.
And
I think we weren't trying to say they were.
We weren't, but it was
a confusion that we had, but the language we used had created. And he was right to reach out, and we had a discussion, and I said, well, why don't we discuss it on a podcast?
And I thought it was
hit this thing head on, and it was a brilliant episode.
I really enjoy, I enjoy most of these episodes. In fact, I think I enjoy all of them. But the thing that on that one was lots of the conversations about diversity and inclusion kind of, this is going to sound terrible, are a little bit, we're going to say the right things because saying the right thing is the right thing to say. Even when people are being genuine and honest, it feels one-dimensional, and it doesn't add a lot to the conversation. The people who feel that this is valuable are going to agree. The people who don't won't. That's fine. What I loved about our conversation was I felt we went way beyond that. Okay, we value this diversity inclusion. How do you do that? We talked about real world. I was hiring people at the time. How do we think about that? How do you do that properly?
And we talked about some of it becomes very didactic, very doctrinal, and this is the right thing to do, and therefore you can't question it. But there are complexities that come from starting to talk about inclusion and diversity that I think we discussed. I don't think we necessarily solved the problem.
No, but I
talked about them as real world problems and challenges, and the frictions that are created. And I think Theo guided us through that conversation really, really skillfully. That's one of the episodes where I think I have reflected the most post-episode about my own beliefs, my own behaviours, my own language. Not in I've got to avoid saying things that are offensive, or because I think I'm relatively grown up about these things. But just in terms of understanding wider perspectives on a really complex issue. So
I think it helped me because when people talk about diversity inclusion after we'd had that conversation, I was much more confident to talk about why. It was good. Last person on my list is Brigadier John Creswell. We name checked John earlier on. Thing that was really great was John is the second in command of the 1st French Infantry Division at the moment. So at one level, he had no business coming on the podcast because he's a bit busy. But I thought that was wonderful how he talked about fear, uncertainty, and we came back to that in other episodes. But I thought that was a really interesting and very genuine take on some of those things. So we have had such a fantastic range of these guests, and thank you for all the guests that have come on. If you're listening, and on behalf of all the listeners, that has been a particular kick for me. So we've talked about guests. Let's take a very quick break, and then maybe we'll do a quick dash through some of our favorite episodes.
Brilliant.
Welcome back. Hopefully you too have a glass of wine or beer. Sorry, I realise there's not much wine left in this bottle.
You're slurring your words.
I'm slurring my words.
It's New Year.
It is New Year. Well, hopefully everyone is also equally relaxed. There's a bunch of Quality Street wrappers, empty wrappers lying around. We talked about some of our favorite guests, and I just wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about some of our favorite episodes as well. And I guess it goes without saying, if you've not caught any of these episodes, or even if you've caught them but you want to go back and listen to them, please do. We're well over 50 episodes now. They're all available. Go download them and have a listen. Can I admit something? Yeah. I don't know if this is terrible or not. I listen to all the episodes. Now, I know lots of people who sort of do grander things and they say, oh, darling, I never listen to myself. I am fascinated because when we record these things and we're having conversations, I'm very much in the moment. And so we're sort of thinking and reacting and talking. And I found going back and listening to it is, I can't remember what I'm going to say next, or any of our guests are going to say next. So actually, that's a terrible. I'm probably a very bad person for doing that. But
I don't think so at all. I agree with you. The process of recording an episode is very, very different. I don't tend to listen to the episodes when they're released.
Well, you've
because I go through the edit process, so I get to normally 2 or 3 weeks later listen back through as I'm editing. But yeah, you get a very different perspective.
You do, don't you?
To the conversation.
It's fascinating.
Effectively, as a third party listening to yourself talking, which, firstly, I find deeply uncomfortable. I think it's natural to hate the sound of your own voice and not like listening to yourself talk. But once you get over that, actually, what I find reassuring, I suppose, is I listen to the conversations and then I sort of second guess what my answer is going to be.
I was going to say, I do. I'm
more often than not.
I'm pleased that I occasionally have mildly interesting things to say that surprises me.
But I tend to have the same views even 2 or 3 weeks later.
Well, one would hope so. I'm going to start with one of my favorite episodes, and actually one of the reasons why it's my favorite episodes is I would argue this is one of the topics that ultimately led us to me saying, yes, let's go do this podcast. In fact, I can't remember who did suggest we were going to do this. Was it you or me?
You.
I must like the sound of my own voice. But this is a topic. This was episode number 3. So I would imagine it was quite clunky and probably the audio was sort of the early stages. We're trying to work out how to do this. But personal narratives, episode number 3. And this reflects, first of all, a topic I'm super passionate about in terms of how people perceive us and how that impacts on our effectiveness. To this day, I do lots of coaching and mentoring. And when I have this conversation with those people and I talk about this idea that it's not how you think of yourself, it's how individuals see you and how that can have a huge impact on how successful you can be and whether or not you are able to solve their problems along with your problems. I really enjoyed that. So maybe I have to go back and listen to it again and see whether I was talking nonsense. But that was definitely an episode I enjoyed. So if you haven't listened to it, maybe you caught up with the podcast later, do me a favor, download episode number 3, personal narratives, because you'll hear stories of why that matters to me.
I've heard out of conversations I've had with people who've listened, that is an episode that resonates with people, but it's a concept they hadn't heard of before. And I think for me, apart from perhaps 3 hags and BHAGs,
I'll come to that,
were completely alien to me, the idea of personal narratives was a new concept that I was introduced to, which again makes it really interesting.
But that's what this podcast has been about for us. We talked about starfish and spiders recently, and the running gag is that I don't read books, but you really do. And so,
but slowly.
That's okay. The slowly. But the point is that it's nice that we can sort of share these concepts, some of which we're both familiar with and some of which we've never heard of.
Yeah.
I've particularly enjoyed some of the military ones as well, which my time in the military was very limited and I was at a very junior level, so I wouldn't have necessarily come across these. But VUCA has one which is really been fascinating, and
it's a really popular episode as well.
Well,
once
you hear about this sort of concept of VUCA and uncertainty, you see it everywhere you look. Yeah. And I've heard more people talking about it, going, "Oh, I know what that is now." So that's been fantastic. Come on, what's one for you?
Well, I had VUCA on my list actually. And I really enjoyed that because I talk about VUCA an awful lot in my day job, in the work that I do. I talk about, so for those of you who haven't listened to it, VUCA is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And if they all sound the same, you need to go and listen to the episode to find out why they're different.
The episode anyway.
Well, of course. But what I really liked about it is I talk about VUCA a lot, but that episode forced me to distill it down and be able to explain it in a concise way. And that has added a level of discipline to how I talk about VUCA. So it's helped me. But I also, it's one of my favourite subjects is, I will have mentioned, and this will come up, I undoubtedly in this episode, I talk about the Cynefin framework a lot. I talk about OODA loops.
No, not the Cynefin framework.
Systems of systems and all of these things. And this is a subject I'm immensely passionate about because I think most of the problems that organisations face, militaries, commercial organisations, political organisations, countries, they come down to the fact that we misalign the problem space that we're in, and we don't recognise complexity over complication.
I can't tell you how many times I've said to people, this is a complicated problem, not a complex problem. So the problem with this podcast has been I've taken this with me.
Well, that's good. And
well, that's the point.
I really enjoyed that episode. But for me, episode 2, and I think for anyone that's listened to episode 1, you'll know that was us kicking a football around trying to work out what a podcast is. So the sound quality is terrible, and B, we kind of ramble a lot, which I think we're doing a lot anyway. But
I was going to say, I'm not sure after 50 episodes we've changed.
But episode 2 is missions, purpose, vision, and goals, and what's the point? And again, it was an episode that made me really think about, when we talk about objectives, when we talk about goals, when we talk about purpose, these are terms that get conflated. They're terms that we use as synonyms, but actually there are, and when you start to talk about their distinct and discrete definitions, and of course those definitions themselves are subjective, but when you start to talk about it, you get into these discussions in the margins of what's the difference between a vision and a goal, and what's the difference between a mission and a purpose. What I really liked, that was the episode we released. Within 24 hours of it being released, I had 2 independent people saying, this is a problem my organisation has been talking about, and they've been going round and round the buoy on this, or if you're American, the buoy on this, for weeks. And actually, I told 4 or 5 people to listen to this episode in my company, and then we all came in and solved the problem in 3 hours. And 2 different people in 2 different organisations came and said that, and that suddenly gave me the spark to say, this podcast has got something. There's something here.
There's something else that I think maybe it's reinforced. So we've only mentioned this 6 or 7 times this episode that I don't read. One of the reasons why I don't read as much as perhaps I feel I should is I get really nervous with, I've read a book and there's a chapter that talks about X, and therefore I know the answer to these things. And what I've been reassured is that I don't think just reading the book is, I don't know how valuable that is. It's words on a page, it's one-dimensional. What's been really great as we've talked through these concepts is it brings it to life, and you give examples and you debate it and you say, I don't know whether I understand that, and you try this. And so there's something about talking about these things, even more than just even someone doing a presentation, let's say, that brings it to life. Now, the downside is I don't know that we ever get to the end of these conversations. We could probably go back to each of these episodes and have a follow-up. It's how you evolve these conversations and concepts.
And the discourse is what's important. And I'm not going to mention names because I don't want to embarrass individuals, but I once worked with a not very competent cavalry lieutenant colonel who was a commanding officer of a unit who was incredibly arrogant but not very capable, in my opinion. And a really good friend of mine who was a cavalry officer who worked with him, I mentioned it and I said, I wasn't that impressed by this guy. And he said, yeah, he's a guy who reads well, but he's not well read.
Mm.
And I think that's a really important thing. You can read a book, you can get to the end of it, and then you can say, I am now better at things. Or you can read a book and you can, and this is why there are book clubs. This is, you can discuss them, you can explore the concepts, and it's the start of a journey. And I think podcasts provide that ability to have discourse. And that's why we're so energized by when the audience engages with us, when we get questions or comments or feedback, because it's about having the discussions. It's about exploring complex issues. And I don't think we're ever going to solve these problems because, well, firstly, you and I are not bright enough or capable enough to do that. But secondly, these are problems that are like the OODA loop. They evolve with human development, with sociological development. And we're not ever going to solve these problems because there aren't any solutions.
Are you telling me they're complex problems rather than complicated problems?
You have learned something.
I have.
I'm very proud.
This is true. This is really true. So going back to favorite episodes, there's two that I'll pull together, which is 10 reasons to spot when your project may not be on track. That's episode 21. And what's the point of meetings, episode 22.
That was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun, and it was clickbaitedly named how to make meetings.
Having spent a couple of minutes at the beginning of
I know. We weakened for that one. We did weaken on that one. But what I enjoyed about both of those episodes, and they're very practical. They're probably are sort of the equivalent of a blog post of the 10 things you should know. But what I loved about both those episodes was both of them were triggered by something happening to me at work and going, oh,
yeah.
And so that the how you know when things aren't going right was something had happened that day in the office when I'd gone, I can't believe I missed that. I should know better than that. And I literally scribbled down 10 examples that became the podcast. And likewise, the how to make meetings not suck. I can't remember whether I'd had a crappy meeting, but it amused us. And that was one of those ones which was less, it's a book, it's a concept, and more, okay, now this is just experience of how to do this. So I very much enjoyed those. You mentioned BHAGs and 3HAGs. So this was one of mine, but you go on, why was it interesting to you?
Well, because it was an absolutely brand new concept. And I genuinely had never heard the term 3HAG or BHAG. And you introduced these ideas and these concepts, and we discussed them, and I learned a hell of a lot. But as we went through, I saw the golden thread to.
So we should say for people who've never heard about this. So BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal. So that's it's how as a business do you find your North Star, or the thing that the thing we're going to get to the moon. And then 3HAG is the 3-year highly achievable goal.
Yeah. And it related so much to the episode I mentioned, episode 2, mission, purpose, vision, and goals. And it related to what we talked about in terms of strategy and strategy not being the same as tactics. And again, there's whole episodes around this. But it was an absolutely new concept. But once again,
it's brilliant.
Those overlaps and related projects.
There's a joy for both of us when you see one of these concepts that's so simple and so brilliant. My favorite bit about that episode was someone I work with. I was chatting to them, and they literally went BHAG and winked. And I just think how that was not on my bingo card for 2023, that someone would use a quote from one of our episodes, wink at me. In other words, saying, I did listen to it, So I thought that was absolutely wonderful, but a really great example. And it maybe we haven't talked about this much this episode, but this was at the heart of what got us talking, which was BHAG and 3HAG is a very business, West Coast America, private equity, venture capital kind of an idea. But what was really interesting was how we then said, oh, that's really interesting. Does the military have an equivalent? And we kind of went, well, yes and no.
Yeah.
It was the perfect example of comparing and contrasting. I can't remember which episode it was actually, but there was another one of those aha moments for me. And they typically, there's 2 or 3 of them an episode, but You talked about the fact that the military is fantastic with its operational art. It's very good at it. It's what it does every day. And yet you then step slightly to one side and talk about acquisition, and they're terrible. And it was just this really, really interesting.
That is a really good example of military, the dichotomy of, and the sort of paradox, if you like, of an organization that spends so much time talking about how it's going to deal with uncertainty and challenge, and then shuts down for the day, goes back to,
I love it when he gets a bit of certainty
and absolutely can't cope. And I was talking today with a colleague that I work with, and he's ex-army, and we were talking about some of the brilliant things about militaries, about the army, about the Marines, about the Navy, the Air Force, some of the cultural things that are great, some of the ways that they can learn lessons and they can be adaptive, and then some of the things that really are disappointing in the fact that they can't learn, and that there are some really challenging things about changing culture that the military epitomizes the worst of the worst in terms of cultural adaptation, and yet it also epitomizes the best of the best.
Well,
and I think that dichotomy, that paradox, that challenge, that's at the heart of what we want to talk about.
And in the same way, I would then say, no, I think you're wrong. I think it's the business world that is the epitome of not being able to say that's interesting. All right, well, look,
there are more episodes to do it.
There are apparently more episodes to do. Let's do a couple of quick fire things. Guests next year.
Yeah,
Gareth, a couple of guests, or maybe types of guests that we are claiming we're going to try and get next year for the podcast.
Yeah, so these are, I'm going to mention 4 people, 3 of which have already committed. 1 is not aware, but I'm hoping by naming them, I'm going to.
Well, you're on the podcast saying you're coming. Sorry,
yeah.
I say you said you're coming. We said you were coming.
So the first one is a chap that I said at the beginning of this episode that one of the things the podcast does is it gives us an excuse to talk to people that you wouldn't normally. And this is a guy who was very, very briefly, as I left the military, was for a very short period of time my boss. But more importantly, I maintained a relationship with, went back and did some work for, and our paths crossed a few times. And then, because he's so senior, I had no reason to talk to until we had the podcast, at which point I reached out to him and said, I'm doing a podcast, do you want to come and join? And he was really enthusiastic. The problem is he left the army as a 2-star general, so as a major general, and as you'd expect, has stepped into an equally sort of high status role in the city and is an incredibly busy man. And so whilst he's really keen to come on the podcast, he has committed and then had to rearrange 3 or 4 times now. So I'm going to call him out by name so that I can add the pressure.
A bold move.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I will message him straight away to say that I've done it and say, now you've got to come on. So it's Major General Chris Bell. And Chris Bell is a guy that when you meet him, you know that he is bright, articulate, charming, but he's also thoughtful. And he had a couple of roles in the later stages of his career in the army, which really required thinking differently. And for things that we'll get into if and when we get him on the podcast, related heavily to telling stories. And it relates to what you said about personal narratives as well, because the narrative, the story that you tell, and we went into this when we talked about not Leonard Cheshire, when we talked about David Stirling and Paddy Mayne, the legacy, the story, the legend, these are really important aspects of when you get to a level of leadership that is not small team leadership, and it's about influencing people that you don't have day-to-day contact with. So as a general in the army or as a CEO of a multinational, or as a politician, half of the battle is telling the story that expresses your vision when you don't have one-to-one conversations. You don't get to have people in a room and talk to them. So Chris Bell left the army and went into a business that is all about helping people tell stories, capture narratives, but in a really positive way. So we're going to get General Chris Bell on, and I'm committing to this, so he has to commit now to talk about the power of storytelling. And that's an episode I'm really, really excited about. What about you?
Oh, there's a long list. So the first thing is we want to get Waitman back, because Waitman's stories about being a tanky and sitting in an Abrams and then latterly a Bradley. We want to hear that. I heard him talk about this with a British armored officer, and I thought the conversation about small teams and the relationship in small teams, that was fantastic.
Again, I hadn't got him written down, but I'm going to mention Graham Jessup, who is a ex-Royal Armoured Corps tanky, but from the UK, from about the same era. And I wonder if he would come on in the same episode, so we could have that conversation about an American perspective and a British perspective.
Oh, I think it would be fascinating.
They're both, I think, sort of tail end of the Cold War, start of the War on Terror kind of era. One from Abrams and Bradley, one from Challenger 2 kind of perspectives. And they'll just talk about.
I was going to say we don't have to get involved in that. We
drink wine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's another person I won't name, but a fascinating, an ex-British ambassador to an African country, and at the risk of sort of teasing it, a particularly volatile African country, let's say. But the reason why I'm not naming them is because they are extraordinarily busy. And so therefore I don't want to overcommit, but I think their story is particularly interesting. They once regaled me with the story of how they were having a WhatsApp conversation with a warlord. And anyone who has that kind of story is welcome on our podcast. But
absolutely,
the thing there that's interesting to me is an ambassador is another one of these slightly unusual kinds of leaders, because you think of them as sort of the Ferrero Rocher people of the world. But the reality was this was a person that was responsible for the people in the embassy when there was gunfire going around them. So I would love to get...
That would be fascinating. And I think that, you're right. The general perception of ambassadors is it's about diplomacy.
Yeah.
So it's about garden parties, and it's about getting called in when your country has a bit of a squabble. But there's so much more, because the things that happen in embassies, they are covered by diplomatic immunity. They are, military organizational hubs. They are intelligence organizational hubs. They are security nightmares. They are dealing with prosperity and commerce. They're dealing with crime, organized crime.
Well, that's the thing. It's the range of leadership,
and as an ambassador, you are not the CEO or the general that is empowered. You are the spokesperson. You are the mouthpiece of the central government. And so judging what you can make decisions about and what you have to convey messages about is such challenging. I'd love to get into that conversation.
Well, this is someone I've been talking to, and we've just got to try and make it work. There's one more I'll talk about, because I know we're sort of running close to time. And actually, this is more of an advert, because I know we actually have this one booked in the diary, but I am really excited to go to Sandhurst.
Yeah.
Now, admittedly, it's the army, and obviously I won't say that on the day, and I'm Royal Navy and you're Marines, but we need to give our army brethren, but we're going to go to the Army Centre of Leadership, and that I'm really excited about, to hear from the horse's mouth, frankly, the leadership. But part of this piece was about where we want to go. We kind of know we're going to Sandhurst, in fact, not kind of. We've got it booked.
In fact, when this New Year's episode goes out, the Sandhurst episode will be imminent. But I would love to go back and speak to my sort of family in the Royal Navy. So a trip to Dartmouth. Frankly, that just sounds like an excuse in the summer. River sailing in.
So, No, no, I was aircrew. Why would I want
Okay.
to do sailing? Sailing's on a boat. I don't do boats. Again, some of my naval colleagues will be less impressed.
Yeah.
But also, you know, RAF, and we joked about this, but I'm semi-serious. Well, the first piece I'm very serious. The second piece I'm semi-serious. Would love to go do Lympstone as well. So Lympstone, the home of the Royal Marines, and here you go. Here's the promise we won't keep. See, that way I'm setting the right expectations. I said to Gareth, what if we did a podcast on the Royal Marines assault course, which, by the way, for those of you who aren't in the military, is famed as a really...
There is the Tarzan assault course, and then there is the endurance course.
Well, apologies. I was thinking the endurance course, because there's lots of... Well, the endurance course. So as a young naval officer with some spare time, at the end of our time at Dartmouth, we were told, right, you lot, go to Lympstone. You're going to do an acquaint. You're going to visit them. They're going to tell you about the Royal Marines. And you're going to do a subset of the endurance course. I can assure you, as a set of aircrew, this was the least exciting thing, except for some of the really keen people. But yes, I have been dunked. I mean... I've always seen this on the TV. It's the bit where you're pulled
sheep
through.
Dip.
Is it the sheep dip?
The sheep dip.
So we should do that.
A fully submerged tunnel.
Wouldn't that be great if you could get some PTIs to shout at us whilst me being pulled through the sheep dip and you standing there with an amused look on your face?
I can almost certainly arrange
We should do that. We should do that.
I'm going to write that down as a thing to achieve for 2024.
I would love that, because I can almost picture it, which is me going, and you going, Chris, we haven't started yet.
This is the warm-up, Chris.
The warm-up.
Yeah.
How long is it? How long is the endurance course?
So it is 2 miles of obstacles on Woodbury Common, and then a 4-mile run back to camp.
Sorry, I don't know if you could hear that. That was a deep exhalation of breath there, thinking. But that would be a fun thing to do, because we could, as we go around, we could talk about the Royal Marines. There you go. Yeah. You can tell me all about the Royal Marines. You can tell me about the ethos. You can tell me about the history. You can tell me about leadership. That's what we do. We're going to go book that.
Yeah, and I wonder if we could probably get the Commandant of Lympstone to possibly jump on for an interview. I think there's things to explore there, definitely. On a similar military theme, and again, I've got a verbal commitment, but we're trying to tie down the dates, is a guy called Paul, who is an ex-Harrier pilot, but also was an air crash or air accident investigator. So when there is a fatal accident or a near fatal accident involving aircraft in the military, for logical reasons of neutrality, they get somebody from another service, but also understands aircraft, to do investigation. So Paul is a Harrier pilot from the Navy, so you will get on very well with him. But he was an air accident investigator to a fatal crash that was an RAF fast jet accident or incident. And what I find really fascinating when I talk to Paul is this difficult, almost paradoxical situation of, these are machines that are highly tuned, technical, complicated systems that have to fly within the limits of the way that they operate. We've talked about my annoyance at Top Gun in this podcast before.
Have we?
I've mentioned it a couple of times, but there's things about the concept of the Maverick that I
that's fine. With. Sorry, I thought you had issue with the film itself, and we would come to blows quite quickly there. No, that's fine. The term about Maverick, absolutely.
But you have to respect the fact that these are aircraft that fly at phenomenal speeds. You're doing 8 miles a minute over the ground. The slightest movement has a huge implications, and the consequences and the tolerances are very, very tight. So you can't mess about. And at the same time, they're warfighting capabilities. So you are having to adapt to new threats. You're having to adapt to new tactics. You're having to adapt to new weapon systems. And it links very neatly to what we talked about with John Boyd in terms of the human dynamic and the mechanical dynamic of
and I want to ask him, because the having been briefly an aviator, What causes accidents is another fascinating thing.
And more
the chain that causes it.
How do you then get the lessons learned?
Yes.
And there's a whole load of cross-pollinated from the air crash investigating world into the world of business about lesson learning. And there's a lot about psychological safety and a whole load of stuff. But for me, what I think really interesting is, how do you allow mission command, something that we have espoused many times before on this podcast, the idea of pushing risk-taking and decision-making down to the lowest possible level so that people can adapt and learn and develop without allowing these phenomenally complex systems to get pushed beyond the limits of their capability. And I think in warfighting, and in my experience as a commando, ground, light infantry, raiding kind of operator, there's a lot more tolerance in the application of judgment.
More room to apply judgment.
Yeah, and actually more need, I think. And so once you get up to that very, very low tolerance space, and so I think it's a really interesting conversation to have with Paul when we get him on.
Fun fact, because this is New Year, I have once in a bar in Helston or Falmouth actually used the phrase, "Yes, that's right, I'm a naval aviator." Just to be clear, though, not long after, she said, "Are you a pilot?" And I said, "No, I'm a trainee navigator." And that ended the conversation there and then. But I am proud that I have actually used that phrase in anger.
Doesn't that just when you fly belly buttons?
Belly buttons?
Yeah, naval
naval aviator. See what you did there.
Yeah.
All right, well, look, thank you for indulging us, audience, as we sort of look back. As you can tell, we've had a lot of fun over the last year. Thank you for listening as well. We've also got lots of exciting opportunities for people we're going to talk to in episodes. Although, to be honest, even if you didn't listen, this is just an excuse for us to talk to these people.
Yeah.
The idea of going to Lympstone and doing the endurance course, probably with my family watching and laughing, that's fun alone. So you have to listen. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, because it will force us to do some of those things. But we hope you've enjoyed the content. We've said at the end of every episode, we do the spiel you're supposed to do at the end of the episode, where you say, subscribe if you like what you're doing, share with friends. We actually do really mean it. We really appreciate every single download, every single listener. We really appreciate your feedback. So if you haven't done so already, email us, battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. That's business with 2 S's. For the folks who are in countries that are far away from here, let us know who you are. Maybe this is very dangerous, I was going to say, maybe we'll imagine a prize for the person who emails us from the furthest place away, and let us know what you're interested in hearing about. As you can tell, we've got, frankly, endless ideas, but we'd much rather follow some of your ideas as well, because that brings some of sort of the diversity of ideas and thought that we talk about so much.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, and let us know what your favorite episodes were, who your favorite guests were as well, because of course we can learn from that and we can see what works and try.
Who else should we try to get on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Either what types of people, or people you've seen speaking, or you've heard of, or you've read about,
or if you in fact yourselves think you've got something interesting to say, and reach out.
We would love that. Yeah. The delight of finding someone with a topic we've not thought about, or bringing something new, would be fantastic. Frankly, even if it's come to argue with us about some of the topics that you've heard us already talk about. On that note, let's call it not just a day, but let's call it a year, Gareth. Thank you to everyone. We hope you are safe, well, warm, dry, well fed, loved, with the people you want to be with, and wish you a very happy new year. And we wish you all the best for 2024. Gareth?
Yeah, all the best for 2024. I hope it's prosperous and you achieve everything you wanted to achieve from it. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
Well, that's it for 2023, and we are really looking forward to carrying on the podcast for 2024. What you may not know is at the end of every recording, before it goes to edit and I cut in the theme tune, Chris has a habit of humming the theme tune at the end. And I've kept the edits for all of these throughout the year. And here is a compilation of Chris humming the theme tune to Battling with Business.
We are now recording. Ding, diddly, ding, 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 ding. Hopefully Gareth will have put in the real music here rather than me just talking about it.
We'll do that. Maybe I'll forget.
Ding, diddly, ding, 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 ding. Ding, diddly, ding, ding, ding. Ding, 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 diddly, ding, ding. Ding, diddly, ding, 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 diddly, ding, ding. Is it changing? Is it ding, diddly, ding, 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 ding. Oh, wait, I wasn't recording that. Ding, diddly, ding, ding, ding. How do I do the variation?
I don't know.
I don't know variations. Is there a jazz? Ding.
Can you have a triangle?
Triangle.
Oh.
I have to come up with the jazz variation. Ding, diddly, ding, 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 ding. Did you listen to the last one?
Yes, the music's very.
Ding, diddly, ding, 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 ding. Do we have to have a more solemn ding, diddling, ding, 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 diddling, ding, ding? That's the more sort of A minor version of
Yeah.
tune.
Yeah. Awesome. Lovely.
Ding, diddly, ding, 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 ding. Ding, diddly. I don't know what the Marshall version of ding, diddly, ding, 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 ding.
It probably have a Wagner-esque
Wagnerian piece in it, yeah.
feel to it.
Ding, diddly, ding, 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 diddly, ding, ding, ding. I can't remember what happens in the second verse. Ding, diddly, ding, ding. Oh, ding. I can't do country and western version of
that
that.
would be amazing. Yeah. You're going to get on a banjo.
You're going to.
You can't put it in mime. I can't cut that.
No, I know you can't cut the mime in. I know you can't, but I did wave my arms in a robot-like fashion.